Your skin burns. Keep going, I begged, not understanding why his touch made me feel that way. The words came out as both plead and command, an impossible contradiction that tasted like copper in my mouth. Nirth's fingers, if that's the right word for the filaments that extended from his shoulder, rested against my forearm, and the sensation spread like a live wire. Heat threaded through my skin, and under it, something else, a resonance that felt like memory being rearranged. I wanted him to stop because my training told me to be cautious, because every protocol leaflet we'd all signed a dozen times over warned against unregulated contact with alien biota. I wanted him to go on because somewhere in that resonance my curiosity unreeled into something more fragile and urgent. I should have cataloged everything then: exact temperature of the filaments, the chemical composition of the ambient air, a spectrogram of the light Nirth emitted, a list of witnesses. Instead, I cataloged the sensation and the fracture it made through me. We were on Vera to make careful lists, to name and measure and map. Vera was a blue moon, a satellite tucked around a gas giant 3 systems out of the Epsilon belt. Its seas refracted the light of the host star into colors our instruments read as shifted electromagnetic bands, and life there had evolved under pressure and blue light into slow electrical forms. Our mission was supposed to be a clean, surgical insertion of humanity into a new catalog of life. I commanded the biology team. That meant responsibility. It also meant people like Jack, who had once been more than a name on my comms panel. Jack and I had ended before we left Earth, but distance had not erased familiarity. He'd signed on to the mission because of his skill with exoplanet climatology, and maybe because leaving together had seemed like a mutual escape hatch. We'd agreed to keep our past out of the lab, at least until our schedules and the insulation of space allowed for that kind of complication. On Vera, the past had a way of slipping through sterile hatches. When contact is achieved, the lead scientist approaches only with consent protocols active, I reminded the team the morning we zipped the suits and descended. I meant the phrase as both a rule and a talisman for myself. The cave mouth we found 3 hours later was a seam in the basalt, a dark smudge against the glittering flora beyond. Bioluminescence pooled like spilled ink within, and the HUD readouts translated the light into spectral waves that made my throat tight with excitement. If you're registering this for a mission log, Teresa's voice would be precise: coordinates, readings, exit strategy. If you were standing there with me, you'd feel the blue humidity and hear the low organ hum of the cave, frequency generated by thousands of small organisms pulsing in lockstep. It was the kind of place that made theoretical biology feel like a childish word for something holy. Nirth appeared in that light the way something inevitable would, not hiding, but rather positioning himself at the edge of our instrument's comprehension. He was taller than I expected, and translucent, with nodes that pulsed with internal light. There was nothing humanoid about him that invited sexual comparison. His form was a scaffold for communication, an organism evolved to translate the language of Vera into pulses and touches. He looked at us, or at least at me, and the glow along his torso shifted into tonal bands I recognized on our visual translator as an attempt at mimicry. The first exchange had been a test. We offered a simple probe, an open palm with a neutral surface to receive a touch. Nirth extended a filament, and the contact was almost nothing, a whisper at the epidermis. Then he adjusted, and when his filament brushed the inner seam of my wrist, the world rearranged. It was immediate. Heat, yes, like a tiny sun pinpointed against the skin. But heat is a poor word for what I felt. The filament's pressure translated into informational packets that the nervous system could not label. I had a flash of a storm sweeping across a low plain on Vera, not with water, but with strands of light. I felt a young organism shiver into a new form. I heard a sound that was more a concept than an auditory waveform. The exchange felt both intimate and objective, like looking at a data set while someone else put their finger on the same numbers and made them mean something else. I remember the oddness of my voice then. I said stop because my rational brain detected anomalies, spike in sympathetic response, unexpected neurotransmitter activity, a non-local coupling that our med sensors strained to interpret. I said keep going because another circuit, maybe the limbic one, maybe an impulse born of raw wonder, wanted to know what the other side of that transmission was. Consent, we later learned in the debrief, had been messy. Nirth's touch produced involuntary physiological reactions. Our scans registered a cascade in the social bonding centers of my brain. That did not mean consent was absent. It meant the contact had made consent complicated, laced with biologically induced enthusiasm. The ethical question circled us like an afterimage. When an organism's biology elicits a response you didn't choose, how do you ensure subsequent choices are truly free? Jack watched the whole sequence. I could see his jaw set beneath the shadow of his hood in the cave's blue light. His face had that look of someone trying to parse an equation that refused to balance, suspicion tacked to something raw. He said nothing at first. That silence was the first ledge we would later look over. Before any more contact, we implemented the protocols we had rehearsed in simulation. Full biometric mapping, temporary blockers to dampen neural coupling, mediation by the mission's ethics officer. We did it mechanically, because that is what scientists do when wonder becomes a potential hazard. We put a fence around it and observed. Nirth withdrew and pulsed in a low chord that our translators mapped as an invitation to continue, under different conditions. I made the decision to proceed, but I did it aloud and on record. I told the team I wanted to learn. I consented again and again in ways the medtechs could log. There is a temptation when you are the person in the middle of an unprecedented contact to romanticize your role. I will not do that here. I will say instead that knowledge is addictive, and that the first real data points Nirth offered were irresistible. Under controlled contact, he taught us in ways our instruments recorded as patterns, that the cave flora were part of a feedback loop, that electrical storms across Vera's plane carried seed-like packets of genetic code, that the species here communicated through patterned light and touch. He was translator and teacher, and though he offered no human words, his gestures stitched images into my mind in a way that felt like being given pages of a book in a language you almost know and then suddenly can read. We learned through touch what normal language could not convey. Nirth could place a filament on my palm and cause an array of sensory impressions that compiled into factual information, an organism's reproductive cycle, an ecological dependency, a map of nutrient flows. But alongside those facts came something else. The more contact I had, the more my emotional register shifted. Joy sharpened into a kind of hunger. Curiosity phased into longing. I wrote this down in a notebook once as emotional amplification, and it felt precise enough for a moment and false for the next. Jack's reactions tightened over the next days. He kept his distance in the lab in ways that made others comment, but the glances that lingered between experiments carried a different temperature. Ownership, maybe. Fear that I was changing into someone he had not prepared for. He argued with the ethics officer at one session, his voice low and diplomatic on the surface, but frayed beneath. "We can't let an individual's experience dictate scientific method," he said. "If there's neural coupling, we need to neutralize it to preserve objectivity." I remember thinking he was right, and that his rightness felt like an indictment. If evidence demands that we step away, then step away we must. But neutrality felt like betrayal when the phenomenon itself resisted purely neutral description. If the planet communicated through feeling, then our instruments would be incomplete proxies for the very thing we had come to study. The early CTA comes here as an invitation. If this story has your curiosity, stay with it to see what choices we make and what they cost us. After the initial encounter, we set up a schedule of contact. Each session was bounded by a list of conditions: a third observer in the room, full biometric recording, a dampening cuff that could be applied to limit coupling, code words for immediate withdrawal. I used those boundaries, but boundaries are porous when the other party is not human and the interaction is a new neurochemical language. The ritual that changed everything happened on the 5th day. Nirth led me deeper into the cave to a chamber where the walls unfurled like petals and the light pooled into hollows. There, anchored to a crevice, was a flower that glowed not in any single wavelength, but as a prism of slow pulses. Its structure was organic and crystalline, a lattice threaded with filaments that trembled with internal electricity. He pointed to it the way humans point to a specimen, and then he did something else. He detached one of the smaller offshoots and presented it in his filaments. Our translators colored the moment with words like offering and bridge, but the truth felt simpler and stranger. He placed the small glowing offshoot in my palm. The contact was minimal, a warm weight and a vibration that harmonized with the pulse of the cave. My hand tingled, then surged. Images unfurled, not memories in the linear way my brain was used to, but sequences of relational data. How the flower was a vehicle for chemical breaks that allowed a particular microbe to thrive. How the microbe anchored a microbial community that fed the cave's larger fauna. How the cave's cycles tied to the tides of Vera's thin seas. Along with the data came an echo of intimacy. In the transfer, something like a question had been asked and answered. I felt seen and known by the planet through Nirth's gesture. It was beautiful in a way that made the air seem too thin for breathing. Jack was there, a step back from the light. I am sure I watched his face before I watched anything else. When the flower's glow met the skin of my palm, his hands clenched at sides I could not see. Later he would call it possessive, and later still others would call his reaction a human reflex. For the moment, it was a small, absolute lightning strike that split the cave into before and after. We recorded everything: the luminescence decay curve, the spectral composition of the offshoot, my neurological response. The med team noted a pronounced synchronization between my EEG patterns and the environmental rhythms in the chamber. Coupling, they called it, precise and sterile. Coupling did not tell you what it felt like to have your longing amplified into a physical ache. It did not make sense of the way my fingers remembered the warmth of the filaments hours after the flower had been set on the lab bench for analysis. After that night, the mission's language shifted. The science briefings started to include phrases like socio-neuro-ecological interface and interspecies affect transfer. We had wanted a new classification of life. Instead, we had unearthed a mode of contact that implicated our emotions in the very data streams that formed the mission's success. Jack's presence turned from watchful to active. He began to question more than the methodology. He questioned motives and framed them asymmetrically. "How can you trust your own appetite for this?" he asked me once under the dim hum of the habitat, the ship a soft breath beyond the porthole. "How much of the data are your feelings, Solana, and how much are you reading because you want to be changed?" The accusation stung because it was partly true and because it came from someone who knew me intimately enough to aim precisely. I could trace the edge of the truth in my own notebooks, the subjective notes tucked in between spectrums, the metaphors that crept into field reports like vines. I tried to defend myself on technical grounds, the med readings, the redundancies, but part of me understood that desire had a way of rewriting argument. We attempted mitigation strategies. We installed additional dampeners, rotated contacts among the team, and insisted that EOC's protocols be adhered to. But there is an awkward thing about dampening a channel when one side of the channel is a sentient being who responds. Nirth adjusted, and his adjustments were themselves a lesson. When the dampeners were active, he pulsed slower and offered smaller gifts, a fragment of filament that hummed a single fact, a trace of scent that mapped to nutrient caches. When we removed the dampening, he hummed a chord that swept an entire ecological overview across my perception. It became a negotiation not just of data, but of intimacy. Ethics meetings grew tense. The ship's psychologist argued for strict separation. The lead engineer worried about unknown long-term neurological effects. The captain, caught between scientific imperative and liability, wanted a conservative path. I argued for continued but controlled contact. "We can walk back if we need to," I said at one meeting, and heard how small that sounded in the cavernous briefing room. Jack's jealousy hardened in ways I could see and in ways that revealed themselves only as small, corrosive acts. He began to insist on being the person who conducted all external scans, as if access to raw telemetry would slow the tide of whatever he feared. He started arriving at the lab before dawn with coffee for everyone, but he would position himself so that his back was to me and his eye line was on monitors. He made jokes in the crew mess with a brittle edge. Some of the team dismissed it as stress. Others began to keep small, watchful lists. I tried to isolate the phenomenon from our personal histories, but personal history, as I said, travels with you even to new moons. Jack had reasons to fear intimacy with an alien intelligence beyond possessiveness. We had once been small-town people who'd both chosen scientific careers to outrun old grief. We had been protective of each other in ways that now looked possessive because they were built on mutual rescue. When I reached for knowledge and the planet reached back through Nirth, Jack's anxiety folded into something darker. The fear that the place where I belonged was shifting away from him and, perhaps, selfishly, away from humanity as he understood it. One night after a long session, we walked together in the hydroponic corridor, our steps loud on the recycled rubber. I wanted to keep things simple, to point at the plant life in a technical way, to show him the data with exposure and clear graphs. Instead, he asked me a question that bypassed the graphs. "If you could belong somewhere else, Solana, would you stay for me?" he asked. I told him the truth, that I did not know. That the bond with Nirth made boundaries porous, and that knowledge of the planet's life stalked me like a second skin. He took my hesitation as indictment. "We built a life with edges for a reason," he said. "Someone has to keep the line." The next days were a mosaic of fascination and constraint. I was not simply pulled by Nirth, I was also repeatedly confronted by the gravity of leadership. If the coupling had unknown risks, cascading neurological changes, altered decision-making, susceptibility to environmental manipulation, the team had to know. I requested full-length analyses of longitudinal data and convened a council to vote on the scope of contact. At that council, Nirth did something I had not expected. He brought the glowing flower to the threshold of the meeting space and left it there, a deliberate offering to the group. It was as if he had read procedure and translated it into a gesture appropriate for mass witnessing. The room went quiet. The flower's light made everyone's faces look like pale artifacts. It sat between us on the table, not token, but test. When I lifted the flower into my palm the second time, under everyone's eyes, there was less heat than I had felt in the cave, and more a kind of steady warmth that allowed for thought. Images came, but they were informationally dense now, like someone presenting a thesis to be dissected rather than an intimate whisper. The med team logged the synchrony. The ethics officer asked clarifying questions. Jack's mouth thinned until it was a line. It was clear to me then that the flower's placement had shifted the political field. The ritual, Nirth's offering, had made the bond public in a way that removed the privacy of my experiences and inserted them into the ledger of mission politics. The act of acceptance had consequences beyond my personal body. People who had been indifferent to the quiet weirdness of our sessions were now invested, because symbols had entered the mission's living space, and those symbols demanded policy. After the council, I found Jack staring at the flower through the observation window from the habitat corridor. He was not thinking of genomes or energy flux anymore. He was mapping a way to regain what he felt slipping. The spiral of his intent tightened. He began to approach me with questions dipped in blandness and laced with intention. "Do you ever worry you're being manipulated?" he asked, suddenly earnest. "Of course I worry," I said. "That's why we proceed with controls." "Controls are for machines," he muttered. "This is living. You can't treat it like a problem set." I heard the vehemence in his voice like the prelude to something else. I asked him what he meant, and he looked away. "You're not the only one who can be changed," he said quietly. "And I'm not going to let you—" He stopped and rubbed his forehead. "I can't see you slipping and do nothing." There is a thin line between protection and possession, and I could see Jack standing with one foot on each side. He was not yet a villain. He was a man whose fear of loss got wound into a plan. He began spending nights in the lab long after the others had retired, checking logs, cross-referencing datasets with a meticulousness that had the sheen of research and the shadow of obsession. He would text me benign links to articles about cross-species interaction protocols. He would leave a screwdriver in visible places. Small acts, we later realized, were the first stitches in a strategy. Ethically, we had to canvass the crew on options. Some argued we should shutter contact and treat the environment as an object for remote study. Others wanted to expand contact under stricter mediation to map the neurological changes over generations. I sat in those meetings and felt pulled in two directions: the scientist who wanted data at the cost of risk, and the human who had felt itself rearranged by contact. My own consent became complex. The initial involuntary physiological response prompted extra caution, and the med team was rigorous in their assessments. They acknowledged the coupling and proposed interventions: chemical dampening, constrained contact schedules, cognitive debriefs after each session. I accepted them and pushed back in the ways I thought responsible, insisting the work continue on a measured path. I consented to the studies and to the constraints. I did not consent to decisions made without collective deliberation. I pressed for public records of every change in protocol. Nirth seemed to understand these social intricacies on his own terms. He responded to our constraints by adapting the rhythm of his offerings. He would place a filament against my collarbone for a precise, timed transmission and then withdraw to observe the group's reactions. His interest was not in seduction, but in a reciprocal relation. The fact that I experienced it as rapture said as much about the architecture of human emotion as it did about Nirth's methods. The friction between human history and the planet's unfolding narrative intensified when defense sensors detected an anomalous emission in the lower planes of Vera. It was a spike of concentrated electromagnetic activity. Our instruments flagged it as possibly a spawning event for an organism we had yet to classify. It was the kind of ecological event the mission had come to study. But those events could be delicate. Interventions might destroy patterns we had come to study or create cascading changes beyond our control. Jack argued we should intervene preemptively to protect the team. The mission leadership argued for observation. I argued we should only intervene if our data demonstrated imminent danger. The subtle political currents shifted under the weight of these disagreements and under the larger unspoken pressure. If the planet could influence our perceptions, could it influence our decisions? If a portion of the crew was already emotionally entwined with Nirth's transmissions, how would that affect mission consensus? In the thin hours before Vera's dawn, I sat in the lab with the flower in a containment sheath. Its glow was muffled by the barrier, but even shrouded it seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I ran through simulations the way a surgeon runs through likely incisions. What if the coupling strengthened? What if long-term exposure shifted cognitive baselines? Would we become, in some ineffable way, part native to Vera? Jack found me there. He stood over the workbench, hands in pockets. For a long time he didn't speak. When he did, it was a sentence that betrayed the genesis of the plan I would later learn he was mapping. "I don't want to lose you to an ecosystem," he said. "I don't want the mission to tear you apart." "I don't want to be torn," I answered. "Neither do I." His eyes were imploring and hard. "Then help me protect you. Ask me to narrate his acts, and I will not.
I will say only that plans were seeded in the space between fear and love, and that those kinds of plans, once watered by desperation, can grow in ways people find impossible to stop. Jack's plotting had weight. It was not sudden. It was a slow, careful creation of contingencies. Agreements with sympathetic engineers, whispers in the mess after too much synthetic coffee, a readiness to argue that the safer path was to separate me from Nirth and from the influence altogether. My own responsibility as lead scientist made that horrific in new ways. If Jack acted to sever the contact without consensus, he might save me from an unknown conversion. He might also destroy an unprecedented channel of understanding and jeopardize the mission. If I allowed the contact to continue without addressing the crew's fears, I might be accused of negligence, or worse, of selfishness. The seed of betrayal, Jack's plan, whatever it would be, hung in the air like static before a storm.
I could feel it as a presence in the habitat corridors, in the guarded looks of colleagues, in the extra security checks around the lab. I caught myself measuring my words in meetings, as if any casual phrase could be a match to dry brush. The last night before the anticipated spawning event, I could not sleep. The cave's memory lived in me like a song I kept humming. I walked to the observation window that looked out over Vera's plain. The host planet was a slow, swollen presence in the sky. The blue moon's surface reflected its light back in ripples that made the horizon look as if the ocean itself were breathing. I thought of the first touch, how the filament had been both a contact device and a translator, how it had taught me in pulses what our instruments could not. I thought of Jack's face as the flower glowed in my palm. His jaw worked like someone trying to find a sentence he had misplaced. I thought of Nirth's patient, repeating gesture, offering the flower again, making treaty with a species he scarcely had words for. I understood finally that the central question would not be answered by science alone. We could not measure whether the bond was right in a clean metric. The question was moral and political and private all at once. Which chances do we take when an unknown other reaches for our hand? Who has the authority to decide what we feel? In the lab that night, Jack sat at his console, fingers moving over keys with the slow deliberation of someone building an invisible engine. He did not look at me when I entered. The screen reflected lines of code that meant nothing to me in isolation. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and steady in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "If something happens to you," he said, "I will not let it be because we were passive." There, finally, was his admission. He would act. Whether his action would protect me or wound us all was a question I could not answer. I walked past him without touching his arm. My skin still remembered the filament. I went back to the containment box and opened the sheath a fraction. The flower's light touched my fingertips, and for a moment I was back in the cave. The smell of mineral and salt, the chorus of tiny organisms, Nirth's slow, patient pupils. I held out the memory like a relic and examined it under the microscope of my conscience. The mission briefing for dawn came, and with it the decision to observe the spawning event remotely, to restrict any intrusive action. We agreed to be watchers rather than shapers, for now. The vote was narrow and weary. Some of the crew cheered quietly. Others sat with their hands folded like people praying without a god. Jack did not celebrate. He packed his bag and left it at his foot. His eyes were not angry so much as determined. I asked him, because I had to know, "Are you going to gamble everything on fear?" He looked at me for a long time. "No," he said simply. "I'm going to make sure you don't regret being human." The words felt like a verdict. That night, I slept in shifts and with monitors that hummed like a chorus behind my eyes. Before dawn, I woke from a dream of filamentary gardens to the soft chime of the alert. The planes were peaking in activity, and our remote sensors fed raw streams into the lab. Nirth's filaments pulsed on the tide of the event, even as he remained in the cave. though he had left us the gift of the flower and the ritual that now made him a presence beyond the substrate of light. I found Jack at the window again, a silhouette against Vera's slow light. He turned when I came in, and for the first time in days, his expression was an unguarded shape. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we'll know it." That was the last sentence of any certainty. There are things I cannot tell you because they have not yet happened in the story I live through. There is one thing I will leave you with, a sensory echo that returns to the opening line and folds the beginning around the edges of what I have just described. My skin remembers the filament as both burn and blessing. It remembers asking for release and for increase at once. It remembers how the scientific instruments recorded a spike in alpha synchrony and how my own hands closed around a small glowing life and registered that contact as a community agreement rather than a private affair. Jack lay awake that night mapping contingencies. Nirth emitted a faint pulse from his cave as if sensing the human tumult. The flower, which had been both gift and claim, sat in its containment, waiting to be understood. The team argued, prayed, coded protocols, and watched. We stood on a knife edge between two kinds of futures, the one where we protect ourselves against the unknown, and the one where we allow ourselves to be transformed.